Welcome to the Internet of Senses podcast. I'm Samantha G. Wolfe, and I focus on the sense of sight. So, when people say that somebody is a visionary in emerging technology, what do they mean? Is it all about an original vision? Is it a creative vision? Is it a technological vision? Could it be both? That's basically the big question that I have today because I am comfortable calling Michaela a visionary, and we're going to look into detail about that. So, Michaela Ternasky-Holland is an award-winning director who specializes in creating impactful stories using emerging technologies like VR, AR, AI, and probably even more as her career progresses, while keeping in the traditional mediums of film and television and even a recent museum curation. So I did write this down because I wanted to do Michaela justice. I'm going to read for this, what I wrote before. Michaela's creative visions come from an authentic place with themes that don't shy away from her own personal tale of loss and grief, her connection to the past, and often show, in spite of everything, hope and acceptance. So she's bringing to light universal truths from culturally specific stories, and her work doesn't tell people to change their minds. It kind of makes you figure it out for yourself, which is amazing. And it's no surprise that she's been Peabody nominated. She's won an Emmy Award. Her work has been recognized at Collision Awards, International VR Awards, and named one of the 100 original voices in XR. But to me, she just feels like she's at the beginning, like literally just feels like she's just started. I'm excited to have Michaela join me today to talk about her own personal journey so far and her vision for what's next. So thanks, Michaela, for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation and I'm excited to be able to connect and geek out and nerd out about, all the things that we love talking about, Samantha.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to focus today because you and I already know each other, and it was really fun preparing for this podcast because I got to hear even more about your story and see you sort of do what you do. But we're only gonna like look at, I guess, part of your career because there's so much else that we could talk about. But I wanted to talk a bit about, to keep us sort of on track, some bit about your personal experiences, your experience with technology and storytelling, and then hit at the end about what's next. With each of them, I think are so like key to who you are. And one of the reasons when I was asked, who should come on this podcast, and I was like, Michaela would be a great person to have on this podcast. You have such a kind of interesting life story and new perspective. If you can talk a little bit about that, and whether it be your family, some about dance, some about journalism, and just sort of set the scene a bit for who you are and what kind of things you bring to your work.
Definitely. Happy to talk about all those things. So, my name is Michaela Ternasky-Holland, and I really came into this world without a father. My father died in a car accident when my mother was 6 months pregnant with me, which was very traumatizing, obviously, for my mother, but also for me as a young girl coming into this world, realizing that I was missing something very key in my family structure. And my father was a skateboard filmmaker and a street skateboard owner, and he really left this incredible void, not just in the lives of my mother and I, but also in this void in the lives of his skaters and the lives of the rest of the skate community. And obviously, due to grief and loss, there was some decisions made by both my mother and my stepfather, who came into my life a little bit later, that I wouldn't be as connected to my a biological father and his legacy and his community and even his family. And so I grew up very much disconnected from that person and who that person was in my life, and quickly took on a different identity as the oldest of six kids. My mother had five children before I turned 15. So between the time I was 5 and 15 years old, she had five children in the course of 10 years. And, that really became my whole life, was being this oldest daughter, making my way in the world, trying to, be the best version of a daughter I could be in a very religious, conservative Christian household. We ended up moving a lot as a young girl. I moved to Ohio. We moved to different areas in California. I was in very different schooling systems. I went from very strict conservative Christian school systems where I had to wear skirts below the knee and stand up for people walking in the door, to having a very loose, more Christian school where I was actually surfing for PE. I also was homeschooled from sixth to eighth grade. I had to move through so many different facets of my life. I realized that one of my superpowers by the time I got to high school was this ability to just let go and start new, like let go of old communities, start with new communities, let go of old school, start with new school, let go of old curriculum or old styles of doing something and start new. And this was really something I brought into my day to day life, especially when it came to my interests. So I did gymnastics, I did track and field, I did swimming. I was very physically, athletically active, but that all changed when I found dance in my 14, 13-year-old self. And I found dance as this beautiful creative expression of who I was, but also this beautiful storytelling expression of who I was. And unfortunately, my parents saw that as a threat to my education. So they took me out of dance and asked me to apply to college and asked me to pursue a career. And so, where you'll find 18-year-old Michaela is applying to colleges, getting into UC Irvine, and asking herself, well, how can I still pursue dance and something that I would be interested in? And I realized, obviously, within the storytelling of dance, the storytelling of being a part of this oldest of six kids environment, there was something about me that loved to experience stories and tell people stories. And so journalism was where I found myself applying to college. And even while I was in the midst of doing my journalism degree, I was also dancing and performing in Los Angeles. And all of that came to a head when I booked a Disney Cruise Line contract, left my college for 9 months, basically dropped out of college, left my degree behind, pursued my dreams, performed not only for crazy amazing audiences on a crazy amazing ship, but also got to meet people from all around the world. So again, this idea of like just leaving it all behind, like I left behind all of college to start fresh on Disney Cruise Line. I also left Disney Cruise Line 9 months after my first contract finished to return and finish my degree, and just constantly trying to make the best with the situations I had. And that really is what set me up today to, I think, blend all these different mediums, thinking about these mediums in a different format, in different ways, how you impact people, how you help people go through an experience, how you also touch people's hearts, minds, souls in ways that you might not realize you can do with these mediums that seem more technologically focused. So that's really my Marvel origin story. That's just to give you context as to who I am and what I really experienced as a kid growing up. I didn't have like a traditional upbringing. I didn't have a traditional college path. I very much have been a DIY person since I was very young.
Yeah, no, there's so many things that it feels like you pull from those experiences in the way that you're like choosing your stories and using your technology or whatever. I don't know if you noticed, but in one of your interviews that I listened to, you said I choreographed the audience. And I was like, that's so right. That is so like it's not the user experience. It's not whatever. It's like you are thinking like a dancer, it feels like, when it comes to have you seen that apply to your work? What about journalism? Does it have the same kind of impact?
Yeah, very much so. I think what was great about going to school for journalism is that I really learned about how people's stories can feel like fiction, real life people's stories. That was really the focus in my journalism class, was literary journalism. And so, thinking about how real world stories can feel so immersive, like narrative mythology or fantasy or sci-fi work, made me realize that there was real potential with immersing people in real life stories, immersing people into, your neighbor's story, or immersing people into the story of the houseless person down the street. Like, that is actually a very compelling way of approaching storytelling. It doesn't always have to be this like Disney-fied call to hero's journey sort of narrative, which I also love. And so when I took that piece of journalism and sort of the backbone of that journalism, which was feeling more like fiction, and then I added the backbone of this person who grew up trying everything and anything without there being a lot of preciousness to what happened to it, really, I think, is what brings this part of me that is very experiential, where I like love putting people into experiences. Like even as a kid growing up with 6 kids, being the oldest, I would love hosting my brothers and sisters' birthday parties. And I was always thinking about the theme and the experience and the invitations and the scavenger hunt and how did the piñata connect with the other thing, and how did we make it feel like a nice flow of an experience for these kids who are coming to enjoy a birthday party, right? But like applying that to nonfiction storytelling, and then on top of that being immersed in a Disney quality experience where you're seeing how Disney Cruise Line moves people throughout the ship, you're seeing the incredible entertainment, you're seeing the way the guest services take care of the guests, then leaving that and going to Disneyland and Legoland and SeaWorld and seeing that on scale with theme parks, you have to realize there's like all these like deep influences in my life that I'm like, oh, of course I would just suddenly fall in love with virtual reality and start making nonfiction stories using virtual reality. But it doesn't always click, I think, as very obvious to other people who are like, it doesn't make sense. How did you go from studying literary journalism to suddenly doing virtual reality experiences?
Yeah, no, I think I relate because it's my background's in television. And so it's like when I tried it, I went, oh, I see this. I see how this all works together. But I like the movement, like the bringing of the movement and the bringing of the storytelling. You offer such a wonderful perspective. So one of the things that at least when I remember meeting you, generally, I think I've met you a few times, and you are very physical, which makes sense. You're a dancer, and you just have this like wonderful energy about you that's so accepting and appreciative of those around you, and it's so amazing. And yet there's a part of you that's also very, like, as I've gotten to know you and I've gotten to know your story and try, that has this sort of loss that you've had in your life, but you still have hope. Like it's this like balance. It's like the dark and the light. And even if you're telling these stories that can come across as, so tragic, but then you still have the lightness with there. And it feels like recently you've even gotten more and more personal with your work. And I'm hoping that for those of you who haven't seen any of Michaela's work, that you could talk just a little bit, however comfortable you are, with that kind of moving into the more personal end of things.
Yeah, of course. Look, I worked for big entertainment companies, like I said, Disney Cruise Line, Disneyland, Legoland, SeaWorld. It was so easy to just become a part of the show and be a dancer and performer. But when I really started making my own work, especially when I moved to New York City and started working for Time Magazine, I still felt like I was performing at a theme park because I was still working for this big brand, Time Magazine. They had very specific things that they would do and wouldn't do, whether that was space related, whether that was related to a national park or a solar eclipse or a movie set. But there were things that I was forming as my own voice within that realm that I was like, oh, if it were up to me, I would actually be more focused on this, or I would be more focused on this. And so once I decided to move on from Time Magazine, I realized the biggest thing that was restraining me in journalism was the journalistic voice of having to be unbiased. And so I started leaning into doing more social impact work where I could say, here's the call to action. Like, here's the thing that we can do to make the world better. Let's not just be presenting interesting ideas or interesting facts for people. Let's actually say, like, hey, there's this place in the middle of this area that needs support for better education, or there's this issue that you might not even be aware of, but you can get involved or you can at least be educated about it. Like, because I am a dancer, there was a part of me that was like, oh, I want people to be active, not just in the immersion of seeing the story, whether that's VR or AR or whatever, but also in the activity after, like the transformative experience of having them actually change their behavior or change their mindset. That's an active form of being a part of media participation. And I wanted people to feel that way. And so I started doing a lot of social impact work. I even did my own documentary about gun violence and survival. And there's a very pure part of me that's very comfortable hiding behind the work and being like, I get to bring this person's story to the forefront. Isn't that so cool? Like, I get to be a part of this and I don't take any of the credit for it. And I feel very comfortable doing that. And again, I think that comes back to the oldest of 6 kids. But the rubber really hit the road when I started doing narrative work. And so Reimagined was this VR anthology series that's all female directed, female led, female produced. I was the director and the writer of the second volume, and it's all about reimagining folk tales and fairy tales and mythologies. And so I remember saying, I want to do Filipino mythology and I want to do a story about compromise amongst siblings. And very quickly, my executive producers at Meta were like, this isn't reading. This doesn't feel powerful enough. It doesn't seem like you really understand this topic. And I'm like, I, as an older sibling, totally understand the topic of compromise, but very much so what happens is like it just doesn't read to the rest of the audience. And that doesn't mean it's not the right theme or topic for you to discuss. It just might not be the right time for you to discuss it, or might not be the right story or the right way for you to discuss it. And so I was very stubborn about it. I was like, no, like we're going to make this work. We're going to make this work. And it became very apparent to me that the best way to make it work was to not talk about compromise and to talk about grief. And originally, I had this father character in Mahal that was teaching his kids this lesson of compromise. And very quickly, I realized I was like, I have to kill the father character and I have to make this a story about grief. Like that's what was coming up for me, right? And I was like, I was so resistant to it as I even knew I needed to do it. As I was getting these notes from Meta, as Meta was telling me they were even thinking about pooling the project at one point, like I knew this was the direction I needed to go. And so, I buckled in. I was like, all right, let me dive into this grief that I've processed it in therapy, but I've never processed it in my own art. And so that was really powerful for Mahal to be this like homage, not just to my mother who's Filipino American, but also to my father who passed away. And then very shortly after Mahal, a year later, Tribeca approached me and said, hey, we want you to do a short film using generative AI in 3 weeks. And I was like, wow, 3 weeks. And the day they asked me to do it was the 30th anniversary of my father passing. And I remember my mom and I had this really deep conversation about my father and about her and about me and our relationship that I never really felt. She told me all these things that her and my father had planned for me and how they had were so excited for me to come. And these are just things I hadn't heard ever be based on just the loss and grief that my mom went through very early on in my life. And so I realized I was like, you know what, this conversation for this generative AI film, especially because during that year I had actually also really repaired and healed my relationship with my stepfather. I was like, this is going to be an homage to my mom. This is going to be an homage to her rebuilding our lives, getting remarried, making the best choices she thought she could make, talking about grief, reflecting on what that is. And so the 3-minute short film, Thank You Mom, is really that. It's like journal entries that are inspired by my own journal entries from the time I was a young girl, teenager, and now an adult. And really from this lens of this young girl realizing she got everything she wanted, right? She got the dad, she got the brother, she got the mom, but it wasn't necessarily what she needed. What she needed was this radical love and acceptance of her mother and what her mother was trying to do for her in her life, which was just about her, the girl, accepting herself, which has been the journey I've been on the last few years. So Thank You Mom is very personal in that way. And now what's really crazy that's come around is this Museum of the Moving Image exhibition. So again, the 30th anniversary of my father's death is this year, and him and one of his mentees who he mentored through skate filmmaking and mentored as a skateboard company owner and I have been talking to each other. We've been in relationship since I was 18, just to be able to connect to my father and who he was, and he feels gratification to be able to be a part of my life and be connected to me. And we were like, how do we honor my father's legacy? And we thought about putting my father's work into the Library of Congress, but in order to do that, you have to screen them at a museum. And I had worked with the Museum of the Moving Image before. And I approached them. I said, hey, I don't tell many people this, but my dad was a very renowned skate filmmaker. Here are his seminal works that he did. I would love to be able to discuss screening his work at the Museum of the Moving Image so we can kind of think about his lasting legacy at the Library of Congress. And they were like, we're not just going to screen your father's works. We think skate filmmaking is perfect for the Museum of the Moving Image. Let's create an exhibit. Let's highlight your dad in the exhibit. The opening reception of the exhibit will be your father's film, and you get to talk on a panel about your father. And this all just happened a few weeks, last Saturday. And so it's just this huge moment of saying, okay, now I'm not even just using my grief or my mom's story or our story as this inspiration for creative work. Now it's come down to like the meat and potatoes of actually saying, this is who my father was. Like, this is who Michael Ternasky was. This was the work he had. This was me. Like, I think about myself, even like if someone made a museum exhibit highlighting my work after I've passed, like that would be a huge honor and a huge joy. And so the fact I can give that gift to my father and then also be able to come out and be like, this is my story about my father. This is the story about who he was, is sort of feels like this like baptism as the 30th year of my life begins in this new decade. And so that's really been my journey to make personal stories. It's been this like slow immersion down. And now the irony is I'm exactly back where I started, where I'm telling real world stories about real world people, but I'm not using other people as, the collaborators and inspiration point. Like now I am the like
Right.
subject matter
Which is
material and
part of
inspiration
part.
point.
I mean, that's kind of, I guess, why I wanted to have you, because I feel like you are such a lovely, wonderful, vulnerable person in person. And then now like the world kind of gets to see that and pull in all your sort of creative abilities to like show and have people have these kind of amazing experiences. I guess that's why I was like, I feel like you're at the beginning, that there's something, years from now or a year from now that will be like, oh, did you see what Michaela made now? Like it just is, they're so universal, but also so specific, which I think is really powerful. It feels a little bit like the visions you have for this. I mean, does it just come to you? Like, how do you know? Like, if there's somebody listening and it's like, there's that saying of like, everybody thinks they have a book in them or whatever, but not everybody does. It's like, there's probably lots of people who are like, oh, I wish I could tell my story. Like, how do you know when it's right, whether it be your own story or even when I know that you've produced or helped with a lot of other ones. How do you know if it's the right approach, the right kind of story to tell?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's multiple factors, and each person will take this like in a unique way. Back when I was helping and supporting other people's work, it was really for me like, does this feel aligned? Like, does the right creator seem like they're making the right story with the right intention? I think intention is huge. And on top of that, are they using a medium that really leverages this idea, right? So a great example would be for On the Morning You Wake, which was a seminal piece of VR made by Archer's Mark, who made Notes on Blindness and Atlas V. And it's a project that really highlights nuclear weapons threat. It's 3 chapters. And I said, these creators are renowned documentary creators. Games for Change is a really great nonprofit. This VR experience is very impressive just from a technological standpoint. But the reality also is nuclear weapons threat hasn't been a part of the conversation for the public eye in a very long time. And a VR project about something like this could really make an impact at very specific levels, whether that's at the public level, the university level, the policy level, the activism level. And I say this all feels right, and I feel like I'm the right person to like help execute this impact campaign. I feel like I'm the right person who can really help create these best practices around how you get VR out into the world. And so that felt very aligned to me. The creators, the subject matter material, the medium, all felt very aligned. I think one thing to also keep in mind is if it feels like you're forcing something, then it's probably not the right time. That doesn't mean it's not the right thing, but it might not just be the right time. A great example of this would be my sister and I are very inspired by Percy Jackson and The Lightning Thief, which is a great series by Rick Riordan, which retells mythology and fairy tales. And I remember being early 20s, my sister is probably in her junior high, high school years, and we were like, let's write a book that retells mythology from a Percy Jackson point of view and see if Rick Riordan will publish it, right? And we had this idea for this retelling of this mythology book. And at the beginning, there was a lot of energy, there was a lot of focus. We were really excited. We did like 2 or 3 chapters, and then it just felt like we were forcing it. Like we couldn't find time to meet. She got really busy with her high school stuff. I got really busy with my work stuff. And we just decided, you know what, maybe it's just not the right time, and that's okay. Cut to 3 years later, I'm making a VR animation series that's retelling mythologies and fairy tales and folk tales. So, and that was a totally different medium. It's not even a novel. It's not a young adult novel. It's a VR animated experience. So that's not to say you don't have a great idea. That's not to say your story's not right. Like My father's mentee and I had talked about doing a documentary about my dad. We had talked about doing a skateboard filmmaking foundation that like funded young filmmakers. Like we had come up with all these ideas, but none of them felt like they stuck. None of them felt like they had momentum. None of them felt like the right time either in our lives or in the life of like the years that have passed since my father's death. But suddenly we came up with this idea with the Museum of the Moving Image, and it just took off. It just like had all this energy, it had all this like excitement, and it had all this momentum. And so sometimes I think it's not about the right idea, it's about the right time. And it's also about making sure, you know, whoever you're collaborating with or whoever you're bringing in to be a part of your team, you have to make sure those are the right people. Because one thing I cannot take credit for is the success of everything I've done isn't just because of me and maybe my visionary viewpoint of the world. It's also because I work with some of the most amazing, incredible people that I trust. They trust me. We have a really great working relationship. We have really great communication. Sometimes certain people are right for certain projects. Sometimes other people are right for certain projects. So the best thing you can do to set yourself up for success, I think, and I know I've been talking for a while, is actually really taking that time and energy to invest in the right people around you so that when you need that team, when you need that community, for example, with the Museum of the Moving Image, when you need to make that ask, people are ready to hear it and they're excited to hear it and they're receptive to it.
Right. But I love that. I mean, you always are like, it's not just me, it's not just me. And then that's part of the reason I think that I love that you're telling your own stories now. Like there's a little bit of like, finally, like there's a little bit of like, you can't deflect some of the credit here, Michaela. Like these are your stories that like resonate deeply within you. And that's why I keep saying the word visionary, because it is your vision. There is so much that is your vision and your ability to sort of bring people together, but in a just kind of a wonderful way. So how are you gonna, I mean, is there a way that it just kind of feels right if it's like the next story that you tell, if you're working on something, is it that it just is like I have to tell this or I need to tell this, or is it that you have to make a change, like there needs to be this social change, like what kind of drives you, or is it both?
Yeah, I think honestly, if you had asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have said, oh, social change drives me. But now that I have been through the social impact field a few times, I see that you can make as much change as you want from the aspect of I'm going to make social change, but it'll ultimately lead to burnout because it can be very intense. It can be very thankless. It can also feel like you're pushing a boulder up a mountain. And so if you don't have that core part of yourself that's saying, I'm also doing this because I love doing it, or I'm also do this because I love this passion or this topic, or it interests me, or I'm curious about it, or there's something about it that just gives me so much fulfillment and energy, it you can't do it just for specifically making social change, right? This is what I have found. So, in the sense that I want to make social change with the subjects and the matters I care about, I can't say that there's everything I'm the best person for. Like, I do think there's certain things I'm just not as interested in. One, for example, honestly, is climate change. Like, people love talking about climate change. They're so passionate about climate change. I'm just not one of those people. So, if someone were to approach me and be like, hey, Michaela, we want to do this project about climate change, would you want to direct it? I might look at them and say, I could direct something like this, but I'm not the subject matter expert in this. And there might be somebody who I know who loves climate change who would actually be a really great person to work with me on this. Like, I wouldn't say yes to something just because on paper it sounds aligned with my brand. The other thing I think that really drives me now is the amount of creative I get to do on it. You know, for so long I was people's co-producers, co-creators, co-directors, and as much as I love collaboration, there is that part of me that you said that really wants to step out and be this like creative director voice and be this in this director role and own this ability I have that's really fun and I enjoy doing it. I love working with teams of people and be able to continue to hone that skill. So now a lot of what I want to say yes to, or a lot of things I'm looking at, are original ideas I'm pitching that have all these things in common. They are highlighting themes and topics I'm really interested in. They're inspired by things I loved watching growing up. They're inspired by characters I wish I had seen growing up or characters I wish I could be. You know, they're inspired by my role being an oldest sibling. They're inspired by growing up in many different environments, whether that's like rural California or New York City. So it really is now about kind of taking all these things I've done in my life and starting to make fun, exciting new opportunities happen for myself. That really drives me forward. I don't want to ever be stagnant, or I don't ever want to rest on my laurels or rest on my awards or rest on my previous projects.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I mean, to me now, it's basically like, oh, that's a Michaela production. Oh, I want to see it. Like, it's like you're going to be the brand, a brand name, and all this. I want to shift gears just a little bit to talk about the technology, because this is, we are focused on technology in these different podcasts, and how technology sort of plays a part in you fulfilling those visions, right? You have that, okay, I need to tell this story. It resonates, but then I mean, I don't think you're just sort of setting up the 360 camera in the middle of a stage and be like, and then we're going to move around it. Like, you have so much
Mhm.
more impact and thought about it. And if you could talk about sort of your approach to technology, that would be great.
Yeah, so my love for immersive and interactive technology really comes from this background in dance and performance because, at one point I was like, oh, I'm going to have to convince the New York Times to build their own theme park so that people could get immersed in people's stories, right? Like, at one point I was like, oh, it has to be beyond, because I love museums. I think museums are a great form of immersive storytelling. What tends to happen with certain museums is they're very much focused on macro storytelling. So they're focused on like one big piece of story throughout history or throughout, a certain subject or topic. And I love micro storytelling. Like, I love the idea that the more specific a story is, the more universal it is. And so I was like, what if there was a theme park that was like this rotating space, very similar to a museum, but also a super immersive via a theme park like experience where you could really experience people's stories, right? Like, I was just thinking about this and realizing, the physical reality is very limiting. Like, building something, having a physical space, like even, working on museum exhibits or galleries or installations or even at film festivals, like physical reality just takes time and energy. Not that the digital reality doesn't, but it allows you to do more things. It also allows things to sometimes be even more accessible, right? Like, I can have an art exhibit or an immersive installation here in New York City, and no one who cannot afford to travel to New York will see it. But if I put something on a headset, then like someone who can afford a headset or someone who has a friend with a headset can see it. So while it's funny to me that we have a lot of accessibility conversations about VR, when you think about it from a physical installation standpoint, it actually creates much more accessibility. So these were the things I think about and I like thinking about. And so for me, the technology is always a partner in the creative. It's always a part of the collaboration. It's also sometimes the constraints of a medium that you're collaborating with can also be the strengths of the medium, right? So if the constraint is you have to put somebody in headset and you have to go through all this onboarding, what is the strength of that ritual? Like, what is the strength of being able to sit somebody down, have a human to human conversation, have this really intimate moment where they're putting a headset on their face? Like, what can you do in those minute that you have with that person that changes maybe the way they think about VR or changes the way they're going to approach this story? So the constraint of that can actually be the strength. For generative AI example, the constraint of generative AI is that it looks really weird and funky and it doesn't feel
It
super
looks really
natural
weird
or normal.
now. That's the other thing.
Yeah,
It's really
that's the
now.
other thing. But very similar to VR, right? I remember in 2016, everyone was like, don't move the camera, you're going to make people nauseous. And that's true. Like, we didn't move the camera because we were worried about making people nauseous. But now in Mahal, I move the camera everywhere because now we understand why you don't move the camera, but we also understand why you can move the camera. And we have better headsets and we have better technology. Well, with generative AI, I was like, I don't want to do a live action, real world person narrative experience. It's just not quite there. It's going to make people unsettled. And the whole part of my generative AI film is I don't want people to feel unsettled. I want people to feel like they watched a good film, right? I don't want them to see the technology. I want them
It's
to
great. I
experience
mean,
the
that's
story.
so great. It feels like the uncanny valley for avatars, right? That you go like,
Mhm.
oh, this feels, that feels, and it's sort of, we're in the equivalent in a generative AI storytelling, but that's so great that you had. So how do you avoid it with the technology? Like, how did you make sure to avoid it?
Yeah, so I just leaned into making a really fun, adorable world using papercraft as my inspiration. So instead of doing live action narrative, right, even though it's generative AI, even though we could show off all of these possibilities, I wasn't interested in showing off possibilities. I was interested in creating a really compelling, interesting story, which goes back to the guest experience. It goes back to somebody sitting in a theater watching something. At least for me and my voice, I don't want someone to sit there and be like, "Oh, this is creepy. Oh, I don't want to watch this anymore." That's just not who I am. I'm not a horror storyteller.
Right.
I'm
I'm
not
not
like
either. I'm like, if you're gonna don't jump scare me and don't put me in something where I'm gonna be like, ooh, gross, and you traumatize me. If there's new things, if there's hope, if there's something, because I feel like you can feel so, especially with all the change, change making in societal, you can just feel so overwhelmed that you're like, I can't do anything. So, and I think that's one of the wonderful, wonderful things that you bring to this is that you can inspire people to do something without making them feel like terrible, without making them feel nauseous, without making whatever. And they were like, it's so wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think my whole approach really is honey versus vinegar. Like, even if we're talking about nuclear weapons threat or domestic violence or surveillance technology, or we're just watching a cute little generative AI animated short film, I think the approach of honey to be able to bring somebody in and be like, let's meet halfway, let's figure out where you are, let's find what you're interested in, whether that's interactive with VR or that's just immersive or that's just with the medium of saying generative AI is really scary, we don't know where it's going, but here's a story that you can watch that you don't even see the generative AI unless you knew you were looking for it, right? Like there's just so many ways that to me everything I do is like a web, it's interconnected. So somebody on the outside looking in there be like, this woman is so random. Like she has a
No,
VR
it's
animated
not. It is all
series.
connected. This is why I have
Yeah.
like multiple pages of like connections. And I was like, in doing that, I was like, am I making connections that aren't here? So I'm glad that at least that I didn't. It is interconnected.
Yeah, because whether you're working with a medium like generative AI or VR, that very much is about not just the social impact of like maybe the theme or the topic you're discussing, but also the fact that you're exposing people to this technology that they might be wary of. You're making social impact. But even in the realm of like traditional films, like let's say, one day I direct a Disney film or a Pixar film, you make a social impact because those films are seen by so many people. So what is the emotion or what is the feeling you want people to walk away with? You wouldn't want people potentially walking away feeling like the world is beyond saving. Like that's not my voice. That's not who I am as a person. Again, I grew up fatherless. I grew up as the oldest of six kids. Like I didn't think I could have a creative career. And like I've come and I've made it my own and I'm standing in my own like voice in my own self and like have learned so much the last few years about who I am and what I want to do that like it would feel hypocritical for me to try to create something like that versus creating something in that authentic voice of like there's hope, there's acceptance, there's beauty in this world. There can be a lot of dark. That's the fun thing I really like to explore is a lot of darkness. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of disconnects. But the beauty is sometimes it has to get really icky and dark and disconnected before it gets more connected and beautiful and feels like that relief or that sense of joy or that sense of hope or that sense of acceptance.
I love and support the work you're doing as much as I can. What's next for you? Even if like, do you have that dream of directing that Disney the Disney film? It would be really full circle there, or Disney VR experience. Or is there, are there other things that you have in the pipeline, things that you want to do? Are there new technologies that you want to play around with, or other things that you're hoping to sort of change in the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't told anyone this really, but I'm going to come out on this podcast and talk
Well,
about it.
and then if it comes out in a month from now, then it will already be out there potentially, but it's okay.
I really want to get back into choreographing. Like I really want to dive back into like my dance background and not just choreographing experiences, which I mean, I'll do that all day, every day, but actually like putting together a small dance company, putting together some dance films, like really diving back into that creative side of myself that I haven't been able to explore for so long. And ideally, I have this dream of putting on an immersive dance show here at Onassis Onyx, where I am right now, which is a really great space in New York, or even doing an immersive dance show for like the Armory or for some sort of other venue here in New York, like the Shed. So that's one of my dreams that I have been incubating for a while. And the other dream, of course, would be to direct some sort of animated series, maybe start even my own independent live action script. I've never directed live action before, but there's a part of me that has this coming of age story that I've been percolating on and wanting to kind of sit down and see what that outline would be for a feature film, very much inspired by like Lady Bird and Dee Dee and some really beautiful other coming of age films that take place in California. And I'm like, I identify so much with those characters, but I feel like there's a unique version of that story I could tell as well. Yeah, I love animation. Like I mentioned, I would love to keep directing animation. I'm actively pitching a couple places right now as a director. And there's definitely this part of me that wants to keep exploring technology. I'm really interested in physical installations, like how do people's like physical actions interact with technology? How does technology interact with physical interactions? So just letting myself be open to exploring that as well. I'm always open minded. I think the biggest thing about technology is I never seek it out. It always comes and finds me. And I like it that way because sometimes I feel like when you're actively seeking out the right technology, you can often get sidetracked and overwhelmed versus letting the story and the creative find you and then saying, okay, what would be the best medium or technology for this and letting that come and find you as well. So yeah, that's like really for me what's on my future horizon. Uh, from another perspective, like would love to have a TED Talk in the next few years, would love to do coaching for people who are looking for my consulting advice, would love to continue to be able to do like workshops and seminars, to be able to keep sharing this impact side of me that I have, the social impact, the impact storytelling, because there's a lot of people that approach me for that skill set and there's not so many of me to go around, but if I could do courses and webinars to kind of maximize that audience, then that's definitely something I want to keep pursuing and thinking about as well in the next few months. So that's really my roadmap, and I'm excited to see like where it all unfolds and how it all goes in the next year or so.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I just get excited for you. I mean, I got involved in the entertainment business and technology business to be sort of, I said, like next to people who are super creative. Like, and I feel like when I'm next to you, whether it be virtual, that I just am like, yes, I've kind of fulfilled a bit of my hopes and dreams myself to been able to have met people like you and see sort of the stuff that you can make and create. But thank you so much for coming to the podcast and giving people a bit of an insight into your vision and what you see. And if people want to learn more about you, where should they go?
Yeah, the best place would be my website. It's just my name, MichaelaTernasky-Holland.com. And from there, you can kind of deep dive into all these different little areas of consultation and directing and creating and speaking that I talked about. And then if you want to follow my work, I have a monthly newsletter that comes out that highlights a few of the things happening in my current life, as well as some of my recent projects. And if you aren't really into newsletters, but you like social media, you can follow me both on Instagram and TikTok. They're both just my name, Michaela Ternasky-Holland.
Amazing. Thank you, Michaela, so much for coming. I really loved having you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.